EFI and IUCN. Good morning and welcome everyone to another IUCN and EFI webinar on increasing biodiversity and climate change resilience in forests for a successful European Green Deal. My name is Kalina Roschakov and I'm a reporter with the Swiss paper Neue Zürcher Zeitung, where I cover climate politics. I've spent the last many years in Brussels following European climate politics, so it's a pleasure to be here. The question we're here to discuss today with a wonderful group of experts is, are climate change adaptation, mitigation, and biodiversity conservation in European forests two sides of the same coin? The topic, of course, is timely. Only on Monday did the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, publish its latest assessment of dealing with the impacts that climate change is already causing today and how we can adapt to them. As you probably will all know, the findings were grim. Forests are already suffering from climate change, and it's only expected to get worse with rising temperature, drought, fires, water scarcity, insects, attacks from all sides. And as the IPCC said, increased heat waves, droughts, and floods are already exceeding plants and animals' tolerance thresholds, driving mass mortalities in species such as trees and corals. So I think this already gives a happy framing, so to speak, to this webinar. Of course, at the same time, forests are becoming an ever bigger focus in climate policy, especially in the EU. They're supposed to help reduce emissions. They're supposed to be absorbing the CO2 we produce, and they're supposed to help develop a more sustainable and circular economy. So how do you bring these objectives together with the needs to protect and enhance biodiversity and conserve nature and ensure healthy ecosystems? That's what we're here to discuss, and I really look forward to speaking and especially listening to all the experts that we've brought together here. Some housekeeping issues before we all begin. Please, to the audience, please ask questions as a general plea. This is supposed to be a dynamic webinar, so the more questions come from you, the more questions I can share with especially also the panelists later today. Do ask your questions by using the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your Zoom window. I will mention that again at the beginning of the panel. Then attendees will be muted, so just so you know, please do include your name and organization. That makes it easier to know who's asking the question. And just for a general notice, the webinar will be recorded. With this, I'm really happy to start the actual webinar now and turn to the first item on the agenda, which is an introduction and overview of the SINCERE project and the Integrate network. So please welcome and good morning to Elisabeth Petzelsberger and Marco Lovrich from the European Forest Institute. Ms. Petzelsberger is the head of the EFI Resilience Program and the Bonn office and represents the Integrate Network Secretariat. And Mr. Lovrich is the senior researcher in the bioeconomy program at the EFI, and he's a SINCERE project coordinator. With this, I hand over to you. Many thanks.
Thank you, Kalina. Can you please click on the next slide? Thank you. So, hello, everyone. I'm here to say a couple of introductory words about the SINCERE project, which means spurring innovations for forest ecosystem services in Europe. It's a Horizon 2020 innovation action. And next slide, please. And here you can see the symbols representing what the consortia composition is. So EFI is a coordinator, but they have a mixture of different types of organizations, starting from research organizations such as KU Leuven, University of Kassel or Copenhagen. We also have some international organizations like IUCN and EFI represented, but also half of our partners are practice-oriented partners, as this is an innovation action, like the Public Institution for Management of Protected Areas in Croatia for Nature Park Medvednica, the Danish Forest Organization, the Belgium Nature Conservation Agency, and Finnish Forest Center. Next slide, please. So what the starting point for the project was? Well, as you know, people's demand for forests are dynamic and they are evolving, especially in terms of these ecosystem services that the society is demanding. And the provision, as Kalina has said, that the societal demands are different and there are trade-offs in the provision, but there are also possibilities for providing some synergetic solutions. And this is why we had this project. We also wanted to see what the different type of management options there are on different levels and what can be practically implemented from the perspective of forest owners and managers, but also looking at the overall governance and policy framework on national and the European level. Next slide, please. So what did we concretely wanted to do? So we have reviewed and analyzed innovations regarding supply of and provision and demand for different forest ecosystem services, especially through a pan-European level survey distributed to forest owners and managers. In these innovation action cases that we had, we ran a learning architecture, basically a way to co-design these innovative mechanisms that focus on different ecosystem services in different regions and actually implement and develop them and ensure that these are sustainable, innovative mechanisms. Also learn from these experiences, see what can be transferred to other areas and what can be upscaled to national or European level, and also to analyze in what kind of policy framework does this for provision of different ecosystem services functions in, and to provide through a wide range of communication dissemination pathways all our knowledge that we have produced in the project. And next slide, please. And this is a short overview of what our innovation cases are about. They are a mixture of different market, legislative, and information innovations. For instance, the reverse auctions in Denmark or Belgium, where forest owners basically bid to implement some changes to their forest management practices in order to enhance, for instance, biodiversity conservation, ecosystem function. Or the funeral forest in Switzerland, or management of mushrooms in northern Italy through a development of an app, development of a voluntary payment system for landscape protection in a nature-based tourism area in northern Finland, or the change regional legislation in Spain in order to address different ecosystem services, especially the watershed protection area. Next slide, please. And this is a very big thank you, and I hope that you are interested with these couple of slides on what we have done. And I kindly invite you to check out sincereforest.eu, where you can see much more. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Kalina. And good morning now also from my side. Esteemed participants of this EFI-IUCN webinar that is organized in the frame of the H2020 SINCERE project that Marco Loveridge just introduced, and the European Integrate Network, which I have the pleasure of introducing to you now, as EFI hosts the secretariat of the network and as such facilitates all of its activities and provides scientific advice. The Integrate Network is an alliance of representatives of different, currently 19 European countries, and is chaired by Spain at the moment. So this alliance promotes and advances forest management approaches for the integration of nature conservation into sustainable forest management from tree to landscape scale at 3 strategic levels: the decision-making policy level, the level of forest practitioners and managers, and third, the level of research and academia. So the so-called integrated or integrative forest management approaches are a key strategy to further integrate nature conservation objectives into practical implementation of sustainable forest management, to combine the provision of key ecosystem services, including wood production and biodiversity conservation in one forest landscape. This is the idea. It was realized that there is a richness and a wealth of experiences across Europe with management measures that are particularly good for biodiversity and are also feasible to be implemented, and which are able to restore rare habitats and biodiversity in our forests, like paying attention to microhabitats such as holes in trees or puddles on the ground, but also more large-scale and long-term strategies like diversifying and adapting to the site, the tree species composition, conserving and restoring old growth patches, and overall diversifying forest management approaches in a landscape to maximize within and across stand diversity. So it's this critical dimension of integration of biodiversity conservation in the concept of sustainable forest management that the integrate network focuses on, and for the reason of which it has also been highlighted in the new EU forest strategy. So the initiative has been founded in 2016 and by the Prague Declaration on Forests, and it receives its mandate from the EU Standing Forestry Committee. And it's driven by the country representatives and their topical interests in integrative forest management, or other call it now closer to nature forest management, and many terms around. So far it's been funded by mainly Germany, but also Switzerland and France. And this year, the Integrate Network funding will turn into a multi-donor trust fund where countries and European regions can support the network. So next to providing scientific advice and organizing webinars like this ones, one important part of what EFI supports in the frame of this integrated network is also this network of demonstration sites for integrative forest management. Next slide, please. So these demonstration sites are called also the martelloscopes, and they emphasize this integration of nature conservation in managed forests. So currently there is across Europe in 22 different European countries, 160 such demonstration and training or martelloscope sites. And the number is constantly increasing, and the interest is really much intensifying, both on the practice side, but also on the research side. And also this training software, the I+ software that is used on these martelloscope sites is constantly further developed and contains modules on, for example, deadwood or carbon, and possibly in the future also genetic tree diversity and other. So this is really one important part of the Integrate network and constantly growing in interest. And well, with this, I hope you found the introduction of the Integrate network worthwhile. And with this, I would like to wish you an excellent and informative and fruitful seminar. Thank you.
Many thanks, Elisabeth and Marco, for your presentations, which were really interesting. And I hope we get back to some of the points you already raised during the panel discussion. A reminder again, and I will do it all the time, so please excuse me, to the audience, share questions in the Q&A function. We look forward to hearing from you, and please just feel free to post it, and I will then pick it up during the panel discussion. But now moving on in the program, it's my pleasure to move on to the scientific interventions. And we have two fantastic speakers and experts to share their thoughts with you. To start with the first presentation that will be on climate mitigation and adaptation options in European forests and trade-offs and synergies relating to biodiversity. That presentation will be held by Professor Jürgen Bauhus, who's a professor at the Albert Ludwigs University of Freiburg, and has a chair in silviculture. Many of you will know him. He's an expert on questions relating to forests and climate change in Europe, and also knows a thing or two about politics and policy, because he's the chairman of the Scientific Advisory Board of Forest Policy for the German Food and Agriculture Ministry. So he's seen it all. And with that, I hand over to Professor Bauhus.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kalina, for this very nice introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak to you. The title has already been introduced. I was intrigued by the overall title of the event because I always thought of adaptation, mitigation, and biodiversity as three things. And you asking here whether it's two sides of the same coin. That made me ponder about coins, and I realized that coins really do have three sides. They have an obverse and a reverse side and an edge. What I don't know, of course, is which of these, adaptation, mitigation, and biodiversity, fits to these different sides. I'll come back to that at the end. What are the synergies and trade-offs between these three different goals of forest management? In an ideal world, they are related like this, where climate change adaptation increases with mitigation and biodiversity conservation in a similar way. And I think we all know enough to say that these three issues are closely linked, and that this diagram here does not represent the real world. But what are really the relationships between these different aspects? That will be the focus of my presentation. Before we start, because it's important, climate change mitigation has several levers. There is the ecosystem storage in biomass above and below ground, necromass such as dead wood, but also in soils. So this take up carbon, but can also emit. And the carbon stored here can also be stored in products that can be long-lived, as in this Black Forest house, or short-lived, as in the timber in front of the house, the firewood. And these can be substituting energy-intensive materials or fossil energy. So we have several mechanisms, and this here is the substitution lever. Now, what are the relationships between ecosystem carbon stocks, so one important lever, and biodiversity? There is a very important study done by Sabatini and colleagues that looked at exactly this relationship between above ground carbon, tons per hectare, and an index of multidiversity. So this is the scale species richness of different taxonomic groups, lichens, fungi, birds, plants, beetles, and bryophytes. And they did that for beech and oak forests of southern, central, and Western Europe. And as you can see, there is no relationship between above ground biomass and carbon stocks and this index of multidiversity. And this is illustrated in more detail in this figure below, where that relates to beech-dominated forests, where you see that, yes, there are a certain number of species that benefit from an increase in carbon, but a roughly equally large number that are disadvantaged by this. So these are trade-off species. And the majority of the species is actually indifferent. This is further stressed by this study by colleagues from Bavaria that looked at the changes in, again, scale species richness of animals, plants, and fungi along the succession in the Bavarian Forest National Park. And here you see that species richness is particularly high in the early successional stages, gap and regeneration phase, particularly for animals and plants, and in the late successional stages, where we have a lot of light, because light is an incredibly important factor determining biodiversity in forests, and also other resources such as dead wood. So that means that we obviously do not just need dense forests in terms of carbon sequestration, but also diversity of forests with different carbon stocks and other resources. Another way of mitigating would, of course, also be to increase the use of woody biomass, such as you can see here through stump harvesting or so. But we do know that this wood that could otherwise also be left in the forest is incredibly important for biodiversity. 25% of all forest dwelling species depend in one way or the other on deadwood, as is estimated for the world's forest. So if we take home from this excursion on the mitigation biodiversity nexus, storing more carbon in forests does not necessarily improve biodiversity. And there are situations where it can have the opposite effect. And removing more biomass may impact in particular on deadwood dependent species. So we need to maintain some minimum levels there. And we need to find a level of carbon storage in the landscapes that ensure a diversity of habitats. And this also includes historical forms of forest use, such as copies and copies with standards. What are the relationships between climate change, mitigation, and adaptation? Adaptation is big on the agenda, as Catalina has already said. We have seen in the last few years here massive disturbances in Europe that have increased in the last 3 years in the period 2080 to 2020 by multiples of reference periods shortly beforehand. And to a large extent, these disturbances are, of course, related to the kind of species that we have been cultivating, as you see here for Norway's spruce forests in the Harz Mountains in northern Germany. But in addition to the species that are particularly vulnerable, there are also factors in the forest that make them more vulnerable to disturbance. And if we look at some of the important disturbance factors, fire, wind throw, and insects, we see in this study from Forestry and colleagues who looked at forest intrinsic factors, climatic factors, and landscape factors that predispose forests to this type of disturbances. They found that forest intrinsic factors actually play an important role too, when you see the variable importance here. So biomass, tree density play an important role for fire. For wind throw, it's tree age and biomass, and for insects, leaf area index and biomass. So we see that also from an adaptation point of view, in the attempt to increase the resistance and reduce the vulnerability, it's also not good to simply increase the biomass in forests. Well, one way to go around that is, of course, to store carbon outside ecosystems, which is also an important European policy, namely, in particular here, where we have large emissions from housing construction and can reduce that substantially through using timber. The question is, of course, also what kind of timber? If we look at how we are adapting our forests, we see in many parts of Europe something like this, which is documented here for Germany, where in the current situation, we have a predominance of conifer forests. This is the dark green, hardwoods are the light green. And when you see from our last National Forest Inventory how that will change once the regeneration layer matures, this proportion of conifers will be reduced dramatically, and hardwoods, which are also more likely better adapted to future climatic conditions, will dominate. But when you look at how we are using them at the moment, to see that the proportion of the harvested timber that is used for material use instead of energy is over 80% in conifers, but only 28% in the hardwoods. And thus the proportion that goes into medium to long-lived products also differs by a factor of 3 between these three. So obviously we have currently a problem there with the shift in this composition where we need to think about solution. So some messages here from the adaptation mitigation nexus. High carbon stocks do not improve resistance, resilience, and adaptive capacity. There are forests where both can actually be achieved, increasing carbon stocks while maintaining timber harvesting. I didn't show you results for that, but I'm communicating it here. And adapting forests to climate change through increasing proportions of broadleaf reduces the mitigation effects of wood products at the moment. Let's look at the interactions between adaptation and biodiversity conservation. There are a number of measures that are very typical and are being discussed and implemented to adapt forests. That is a change in tree species composition. And this can have both, in terms of biodiversity, positive or negative effects. Positive, where it changes to a more natural tree species composition, and maybe more negative, where we introduce species that have not been part of the native communities and that are largely unrelated to existing native species. However, there are measures such as increasing tree diversity and stand diversity of the landscape, or keeping water in forests rather than draining it, that will likely increase biodiversity. And other measures such as more intensive thinning and reducing the rotation length may have more negative effects. But as you can see here, for the current distribution of tree species richness in European forests, we have still almost 1/3 of forests as monospecific forests. And again, a large proportion of these are actually conifer-dominated forests. So these kind of adaptation measures may actually improve the biodiversity situation. The recent disturbances that we have seen in many parts offer, of course, also opportunities for adaptation. This is a situation in forests where you can really change the species composition. But we may ask, what capacity do forest owners actually have to carry out this adaptation? And this is a question that's particularly important in Europe, where 60% of the forest is owned by private forest owners. I think we need to be aware that at the moment, 90% or more of the income of most forest owners is from selling timber. And in the future, their income will likely be reduced through more frequent disturbances that lead to less utilizable timber, market distortions, and the loss of their assets. But there will also be, in many situations, a reduced productivity with climate change and a shift to less economically profitable species. At the same time, they will be faced with increasing costs for regeneration, forest protection, tending and harvesting operations, risk management, etc. So in terms of adaptation, what we're asking for them is to carry out strong investments in a situation of very high uncertainty. And this doesn't really fit together. And thus, there's a case for supporting these people to carry out the kind of management in terms of adaptation, biodiversity conservation that we as society would like to see. Let me step one step back and think about what biodiversity challenges do we actually have in European forests, and how might they be addressed. And you see on this list here that ranges from climate change impacts to new pests and diseases, land use changes, to eutrophication and invasive species. And what kind of measures do we have to address that? These range from protection to restoration or adaptive management, adaptation, the expansion of forests by enlarging the forest area. But some of these factors are also outside the control of forest management. And the thickness of this line is meant to indicate how important these options are. But what you can see is that obviously protecting, in particular through strict protection of forest, is an answer only to some of these options. And for many of the other issues, we need to pursue an active kind of management. That brings me to the question, where do we want to move to from our current situation? What you see here is a back of the envelope calculation, or you could also call it a thought experiment on where we want to move with these different broad forest management types that we have in Europe. If you think about the plantations, the strict reserves, and the remaining forests, which I call for simplicity reason multifunctional forest, This is what the distribution in Europe at the moment looks like. When you think about some of the objectives that have been communicated in the biodiversity strategy, now you may end up, and this is probably not too far-fetched, with 20% of strict reserves. And the question is what influence that has. So currently, these are the proportions that go into this figure. Other assumptions in these calculations are that we have an average productivity of 6 cubic meters and 140 million hectares of forests available for wood production. And if we increase the strict reserve area and wanted to compensate that in Europe, meaning we still wanted to harvest overall the same amount of biomass, we may have to increase the plantation area to 10%. Or we increase the imports or reduce our consumption through more efficient use. And at the moment, I don't see a clear direction in Europe. No, I hear more bioeconomy. I hear more wood for housing construction. I hear more reserves and the remaining area. What happens to that? There we want to move to more close to nature forest management, which may also reduce the productive capacity to some extent in this area. So this is an important question. I don't have an answer to that, but that may be something to be picked up. So what messages for this adaptation biodiversity nexus? We have clear synergies and trade-offs between typical forest adaptation measures and biodiversity conservation. We have many biodiversity challenges that cannot be adequately addressed through strict conservation. We need active management, and for that we need people who are willing to do that. And we have a decreasing capacity of forest owners to adapt forests in the current situation. Let me come to conclusions and recommendations. So these three issues are intrinsically linked. There are clear synergies, but also trade-offs, and these are context specific. Therefore, broad brush policies may not be very helpful here. I believe that climate smart forestry that considers storing carbon also in long-lived wood products and substitution effects while developing and protecting carbon stocks, biodiversity and ecosystem services through active management offers a much needed flexibility to respond to future challenges. To respond to these future challenges, we need multiple development options to maintain that flexibility also through equally flexible and adaptive policies. I see some problems there. The people who own and manage forests in Europe require support to carry out what we as society want from forests. And there is the issue of the three-sided coin. So to be honest, I don't care which is on the obverse and which is on the reverse, but I believe that adaptation is on the edge of the coin because it makes the coin move and it makes the coin spin. The problem I think that we have when we talk about these issues is that most people have this coin sitting on the desk or something, and they always look only on one side. So if we stand the coin on the side and make it roll and spin, we can see it from all sides. And that is important in this debate. Thank you for your attention.
Many thanks for this presentation, and especially all the points which I hope we will unpack a little bit more in detail at the panel discussion where you will be joining us. So I look much forward to that. So to all of you that have already dropped questions, many thanks for that. I'm keeping tab of them and I will post them as soon as we start the panel. Now moving on, however, with the second presentation of the day, which is going to deal with the question, whose resilience, socioeconomic perspectives on the forest climate change biodiversity triangle. Many thanks to Georg Winkel for joining this webinar at such short notice, especially, and for being here. It's great to have you here and to hear from you. For all of you who don't know them, which I doubt are many, Georg is a professor at the Wageningen University and research and holds the chair for the Forest and Nature Conservation Policy Group. Until this year, and that's where you probably also will know him from, he was the head of the European Forest Institute Bonn office and has a particular interest in making policy better. And because of that, of course, I look forward to then taking his insights and discussing them with the panel. Georg, I'll pass over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Kalina, for the friendly introduction and greetings from Wageningen. I hope you can all see my slide and hear me. This seems to be the case. Yeah, this is a special morning for me because first, it's really nice to be back with the Integrate Network, with the SINCERE project in the EFI-IUCN collaboration. But also it's a challenging morning because we face major geopolitical disruptions that will for sure have an impact also on forest policy and the debates we will have in the future on the issue. But that's not the topic for me this morning. I would like to talk about social science perspective on the forest climate change biodiversity triangle. I think it's a complementary presentation to the one by Jürgen we just heard. I will give a short introduction first, climate change in Europe's forest, really short because we have heard a lot on that in a much more solid way by Jürgen. Then I would like to focus on social science research, looking into responses in policy and also forest management, identifying controversies and also strategies. Then I would like to conclude to give a bit of food for what I hope will be an interesting panel discussion. Just to begin, this is not the latest IPCC report, but it's a figure from the 2019 report where you can see the quite alarming change in the global temperature on surface over land, but also over the ocean. To make it short, we are in a period of accelerating climate change, of increasing temperatures, and this is rather an increasing trend, and it obviously has impacts on forest and forestry. And these impacts are on one hand long-term changes in the climate, affecting water availability, affecting the overall ecological needs of the tree species and how they can deal with the changing climate. But also we see an increasing significance of extreme weather events and related disturbances. It's a coincidence that I choose also a picture from the Harz Mountain, which is a quite famous example of dying spruce plantations or spruce forest in and without the national park there. So obviously we can expect a major impact. And I find that map specifically illustrative. It's from a bit older publication in Nature Climate Change by Mark Hanewinkel and co-authors. And they worked with different scenarios and tried to model the future of Europe's forest. And I found that quite illustrative, what they call an extreme scenario, which I understood is at the moment a bit the track we are on in climate change, where you can see that if you take this scenario and you model forest composition for the years 2071 to 2100, a lot of Central Europe has become a Mediterranean oak forest. A lot of Scandinavia has become a temperate oak forest. The spruce has been escaping far to the north, and the beeches where it's now seen, I believe, as an invasive species in Scotland. We all can be sure that this will not be the case as such, because if you know how long an oak takes to grow, it's rather unlikely that in central Finland we will have what we now see as oak forest, temperate oak forest 60 years from now. So the message of that is we may face unprecedented major changes in our ecosystems in the longer future if we cannot mitigate climate change. And secondly, this has impacts on biodiversity. Obviously, species will have different possibilities to adapt and to also migrate to adapt to a changing climate. But it also has important consequences on the economics of forestry. If you look at the productivity of different tree species dependent production systems, which was introduced by Jürgen. So we can perhaps expect a shift of forest productivity to the north of Europe. However, I now would like to focus mostly on the responses in policy and management, and also a bit looking into controversies and strategies, an issue that the previous speaker has been touching upon shortly already. This is from work we have been doing on EU forest policy in the past, and basically it was also updated in the SINCERE project, which is co-hosting or hosting this event. And here you can see two quite distinct perspectives, or if you want to say extreme poles a bit in the perspective on forest in Europe. One is labeled here the forestry and timber perspective, the other one the nature conservation perspective. They differ with regard to the view of forest, major policy goals, resource management paradigms, and also the actors that are sharing the respective perspective. To begin with forestry and timber, here forests are mostly seen as a renewable natural resource. Major policy goals are the bioeconomy transformation, a sustained timber use, sustainable forest management is a resource management paradigm to support forest producers and forest owners to rely on market governance and markets, but also giving incentives for the provision of other ecosystem services are a main policy focus here. And if you look a bit which actors share that perspective based on that research, it's within the Commission, rather DG Agriculture, it's forest-rich member states in the EU, Finland, Austria, Sweden, it's forestry and forest industries, NGOs and forest departments. Quite an opposite perspective is voiced here, the nature, which we labeled here in this publication, the nature conservation perspective. Here, forests are seen as an ecosystem with irreplaceable biodiversity. Major policy goals are to keep nature, to have nature, to conserve biodiversity. Resource management paradigm is conservation, and also recently closer to nature forestry, which can also be seen partly as a bridging concept. The main policy focus is quite different than on the left side. It's protecting forests through regulation, but also providing, and there's a lot of overlap, incentives for the provision of forest ecosystem services. And actors that adhere to that paradigm is within the Commission more DG Environment, also more forest poor or urbanized member states and environmental NGOs. Why does this matter for the discussion about resilience, about climate change adaptation and mitigation? Well, in both perspectives, in both policy perspectives, there is a kind of consensus that the resilience of forests through adaptation should be increased. But then there are different main objectives or underlying values attached to the understanding of resilience. Therefore, also my title, Who's Resilience? On one hand, there is what you may label a more forest production resilience. Here, the main concern is to ensure productivity of what is called healthy forests, to minimize risks for timber production, and make the timber production system resilient. On the other side, there's what you can label to be a forest conservation resilience. Here, the main idea is to ensure that future forest ecosystems are rich in biodiversity. The idea is to minimize a loss of species and habitats and make the ecosystems biodiversity resilience. If you continue with that dichotomy, and come back to the conservation vis-a-vis forestry timber perspective, we can identify two different narratives or lines of arguing about mitigation and adaptation relating to forest biodiversity and climate change. In a conservation perspective, forest ecosystems are seen as threatened by climate change and they need to adapt naturally. In a forestry timber perspective, forestry is seen as a main mean to adapt and mitigate climate change. To begin with the conservation view, the conservation of old forest stand, long timber harvesting rotation periods are seen as a suitable mitigation strategy. Adaptation is preferred to happen through natural dynamics, better protection against additional structures, including intensive timber management, but also through ecological corridors to allow for a migration of species. On the forestry timber side, sustained or increased timber production and the bioeconomy relating to that and used as seen as the best mitigation strategies. The idea is also here to reduce rotation ages and standing volume in order to minimize risks, and also known native but well-adapted tree species should be included. I think it's interesting to see that, for instance, the disturbances or changing disturbances patterns can be interpreted quite differently depending on what perspective you have here, partly as seen as a natural dynamic, helping adaptation on the one hand, or as a major challenge for productive forest ecosystems. Now let's move to the perspective for forestry practitioners and experts that I think the previous speaker has also highlighted is quite important in what's really happening on the ground in terms of adapting forestry and forest management to climate change. This is data generated within the European Forest Institute and the Bee Forest project by colleagues Dennis Reutsch, also together with Markus Lindner. And we did a survey in 9 different European countries mostly with forest owners and managers, but also different forest-related experts, and asking them questions about the impact of climate change and possibilities to adapt. Here you can see an evaluation of the responding a sample of about 550 responses. So it was quite an exploratory exercise on the effects of climate change in forests and forestry, what they expect at the moment and until 2050. We don't have the time to go in details. We gave them a spread between 1 very negative and 7 very positive. But what is interesting is that you have a sort of north-south gradient from observing more or less balanced effects, partly positive, partly negative in the Nordic countries, Finland, Norway, and Sweden at the moment, and also expecting them until 2050 towards really negative effects in the south of Europe, in Portugal, Spain, but also in Germany, that was at the time of the survey heavily affected by an extraordinary drought and heat wave. So this is visible by the numbers that there were mostly negative effects expected in the south of Europe, but also Germany, and more balanced effects expected in the north, that you can see on the very right column. To continue with that survey, because I think it's quite illustrative and sheds a bit of perspective into the views of forest managers and forest practitioners, we also asked to what extent do you think it's possible to adapt forests to climate change through forest management measures by 2050? And again, here you have a north-south gradient with some exceptions that in between, ranging from Finland to and Norway to the more southern countries. But what you can overall see that there is a kind of slight positive perspective towards the possibility to adapt from a known possible 1 to 7 fully possible. At least there is some confidence, especially again in the Nordic countries, but also in Italy, that adaptation is possible until 2050, while there is less confidence in Spain and Portugal, but also in Germany, which we try to connect to this idea of an extraordinary impact of the drought 2018-2019 at the time of the sample when the survey was conducted. Finally, we asked about the importance of different climate change adaptation measures. And this is again to give you a short overview. What scored the highest, I believe in all countries, is the diversification of tree species. So the need to diversify forestry and forest management practices. And then you can see elements of both, let's say, political mitigation adaptation strategies I introduced on the previous slide. And they're scored well at different levels. I have continuous cover forestry and shortening rotation periods, obviously 2 different antipodes in the discussion. They both scored on a medium rank. They ranked mediumly high. Let's put it like that. There was specifically for continuous cover forestry a huge IQR, meaning there was a huge variety in answers from not at all important to extremely important, which indicates, if you look at this IQR, that there was a huge distribution of the answers, which relates on one hand to what the previous speaker said, potentially context-dependent diversity of adaptation strategies, but also to very different viewpoints and forest management cultures, which people see as suitable of dealing with climate change. We are still working on the data, and there will hopefully be a publication, but there's also clearly a need for further research on how forest managers across Europe respond to climate change in practice. To conclude, climate change is increasingly affecting Europe's forests and forestry. I think it's important to state this, but the perceptions of forestry practitioners and experts relating to the impact of climate change on forests across Europe vary significantly, and also the perceptions of what are suitable adaptation measures. It is important, in my view, to stress that the policy and management objectives will significantly determine possible adaptation strategies. It might be a big difference if the idea is to adapt forest biodiversity or to adapt a forest production system for wood production. There is a consensus across different political worldviews and perspectives that diversification is an appropriate adaptation strategy, whatever it means in detail. There's, however, dissent about the best options to increase forest resilience, mostly with regard to the potential of closer to nature forestry up to non-intervention forestry vis-a-vis intensified forest management, and also the use of native vis-a-vis known native tree species. this somehow calls for, if you look at the consensus on diversification, for combining strategies at a landscape level. There's finally a need, also in my view, for further research, perhaps not surprising as a researcher saying this, on one end to connecting really empirical observations, what is currently happening with European forest with modeling. And I think this needs to go beyond a purely academic research approach to really integrate those that working with the land, forest owners, forest managers, but also conservation managers and experts to link their observations about the changes they can see now with climate change increasingly impacting forests and forest management, to link that with scientific modeling and data. So I think there is a certain need for trying out new approaches to gathering data and to integrate local and scientific knowledge. There's also a need, in my view, to assess evidence across what I would say the forestry and conservation research silos, to identify what do we really know, where do we agree, and where do we disagree, also facing an uncertain future, and the challenging questions of how will forest really look like in 30 or 50 years. Thank you very much, and I would like to give a special thank to my former EFI colleagues Dennis Reutsch and Markus Lindner, but also to Mark Hannewinkel from University of Freiburg, who had in the previous version of this presentation supported it with slides and comments. Thank you very much, and I hope I'm not talking to my laptop, but that you're still all there.
Still all very much there. Thank you very much for this presentation. Also allowing me to now continue with the panel and especially moving on also to this policy discussion. I thought it was very helpful how you laid out exactly this European policy discussion space, because that is exactly also something we would like to dig into now with the panel. And so it is my pleasure to introduce the panelists, starting with Peter Löffler, who you see now. I think all the panelists are showing up in their videos. So Peter Löffler is a policy officer in the European Commission's Director General Climate Action. So he's obviously working on all of the various European Green Deal policies, and he is especially dealing with climate adaptation and resilience policy. He has been involved in the development of the EU Biodiversity Strategy, the Adaptation Strategy, and the Forest Strategy. And so in a way, he embodies all the contradictions and conflicts that Georg has just laid out to us very, very helpfully. Moving on, it is also my pleasure to introduce Daniel Rego. I'm not sure whether his video is already up, but Daniel is from the Spanish Ministry for the Ecological Transition and the Demographic Challenge, and is the current chair of the Integrate Network, which we've already heard about before. And welcome, and thanks for joining us. He's a forest engineer and works on international forest policy, soil policy, and desertification, which is, of course, talks to many of the challenges that have been raised that European forests are already facing today. Moving on, I'm very happy to say that Kelsey Perlman is joining us. She's a forest and climate campaigner with the NGO Fern. Nice to see you again from another life. And as many of you probably will also be familiar with, she's been on the Brussels campaigning scene for a while, has worked in international and European climate policy for the past 6 years, and has dealt with various institutions ranging from the aviation industry to the UNFCCC and now the forests world. So again, bringing, as Georg also was raising, a multidisciplinary approach to the issue. And with that, I would like to say many thanks, especially also to Jürgen Bauhus, who's agreed to join the panel, which is great because there's been a lot of questions already that came in through the Q&A function. So thanks very much to all of the floor for sharing your questions. I will start with them ASAP. But first of all, I would like to turn to the panel and hear from you. What are the two main takeaways or thoughts that you take away from the two interventions so far? And what perhaps has surprised you or has given you thought, food for thought? I'll start with Kelsey and then Peter and then Daniel. And perhaps Jürgen, if you want to say something about Georg Winkler's presentation, more than welcome.
Great, thanks a lot. I hope you can hear me well. So yeah, it was very fascinating presentations that came forward. I liked the reference to a coin that has three sides. I might even think of a cube, or maybe the sort of conical shape of the SDGs when we talk about the question of forests, and add maybe to biodiversity and mitigation, the future of the industry. And so this is something that I hope we can dig into a little bit more when we start talking about the policy options that are there, because, you know, we know that the sector has gotten, you know, billions a year in subsidies that lean towards more the intensive management focusing only on products, but we haven't had a very large discussion about the ways that policies can be changed to get us to think about these questions of management, and to basically hit the large middle of the pie chart that that Mr. Bauhaus presented around multifunctional forestry, and actually being able to define that. So I think, yeah, being able to talk about what the policy options are is going to be specifically important, because one of the things that was pulled from the IPCC report is this idea that better management is a huge option for the forestry sector. But what we found in Europe is that we haven't really been able to define in a concrete way what sustainable forest management is. And we have a lot of tools on the table that I hope we can sink our teeth into in this panel discussion, to be able to move in that direction, where we can actually balance improving biodiversity, which is quite low in Europe, you know, using a variety of indicators, talk about these social issues like the declining employment in the forestry sector around silviculture, wood processing, and paper, and also talk about how we approach climate change mitigation. Because I think the last point I might put my finger on is the fact that maximizing for carbon isn't necessarily your best option. We need to balance multiple objectives at the same time. So those are my first impressions.
Peter.
Okay, well, thanks very much for giving me the floor. Great to be here with all of you today. And particular thanks also to all the speakers in our Georg, Jürgen, the others. Very, very good actually to be in touch again with the Integrate network. I was down as an European Commission observer on the slides of Elisabeth. Actually, I was a supporter of Integrate. I followed this project from the very beginning, and I was quite enthusiastic about it. So it's good to be in touch again. Interesting, by the way, also to be referred to someone who embodies the contradictions. Well, you know, I sort of like to believe of myself as someone who tries to be the one who embodies the attempts to overcome and reconcile those contradictions and find the sweet spot. So maybe just that on my role. Two takeaways from Georg's and Jürgen's talks, maybe. On Georg's talk, I'm in a way, I'm no stranger to many of these debates and points raised. I like very much sort of the way Georg spoke about diversification, you know, not even diversity, but diversification. I think, you know, we have a lot of reason to believe that a good degree of biological diversity is good for climate resilience of forests. But beyond that, really, I think diversity overall, diversity of management approaches. Yesterday, I was on a different event where the diversity of value chains was mentioned. And I think, you know, with climate change, we are up for an uncertain future, and the more diverse diversity there is, and the more we also experiment and learn on how to handle these things, the better a chance have we to. We have to understand what we can do, what we can realistically achieve, but maybe also where our limits are. So I think, you know, big thumbs up to sort of diversification. Second point on maybe coming back to Jürgen's talk, again, very informative, and yes, Jürgen, I mean, you know, you pulled out many of the key articles and pieces of research in the area. I think what is really makes this very interesting, right? You know, Jürgen sort of gave a state, I think, in my view, of the current debate about, you know, trade-offs and synergies and all that. But what makes things really interesting is that with climate change, we enter into a very dynamic context. The IPCC report, which has already been mentioned, last year the IPCC said we are about 20 to 30 years away from a +2 degree global future. And that is the, that is the scenario which the Paris Agreement tried to prevent so far. It may be, we may be there already in 2050. And this is when IPCC says we have fairly catastrophic consequences in ecosystems. So bad news, we are really up for a rough ride. We have started a period of forest transformation, I think. This is the beginning of it. And so I think also all these debate and with this sort of policy convergence, I think the triangle is well set out. And I'm long enough in the EU institutions to be able to say that under the Green Deal, I think this triangle is really being addressed by EU policies. It was very encouraging to see how much we just work across different services, how much work there is being done to try to sort of somehow bring these aspects together and not work on them in isolation from one another. And overall, I think we've got actually a pretty good sort of EU framework in place. And it is a framework, it is that. I mean, Jürgen said, what, it can, to some degree, it only can be a big framework which needs to be filled with life, also through national forest policies and the actual work of individual forest holdings and forest owners. And this is also where the conflicts are. I understand that, but I think we offer quite a lot of opportunities there, which can be brought to life ideally. And one of the big questions is really also what happens at the national level, and of course, what can individual forest owners do, and what are they doing right now? Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to dig into especially those questions in a bit, but now moving on to Daniel.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this panel. So many interesting things have been said today already that it's going to be really hard to focus just on two. I would like to thank Marco and Elizabeth for their comments. I think the SINCERE and the Integrate projects are very interesting. And I think with projects like this, we can really move forward and ensure that we change the way we manage forests, or we do forest policy in the future, and that's what's going to help us. But if I have to focus just on two things, I think that the three sides of the same coin, just like Kelsey said, is one of the most important things that have been mentioned today, because it is true that adaptation, mitigation, and biodiversity conservation have trade-offs and synergies. Sometimes some measures can be beneficial for all of them, and sometimes they won't. But I think that it is important to realize that we don't have to ensure that we maximize the three of them in every single place. We are going to have to take them into account every single time. But in this case, and since I'm the president of the Integrated Network at the moment, I'm going to talk about integration and segregation. The same way we can talk about integration and segregation when we're talking about timber production and biodiversity conservation, we can apply that same approach to the way we use forests to mitigate climate change and conserve biodiversity. We can either mitigate and conserve biodiversity in every single forest, or we can choose some forests that are going to focus more on mitigation on climate change mitigation, and others that will focus more on biodiversity conservation. So if a specific measure that's very beneficial for climate change is not very beneficial for biodiversity conservation, that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It may be bad in some cases if it's very negative for biodiversity, but not in every single case. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is that all these things are what makes the job of policymakers like me quite hard, because the answer isn't simple. It's not like there's a measure that's beneficial and it's good for everything. We have to take all these things into account and make sure that while we're trying to promote a specific thing, we don't impact negatively another one. And then another thing that I would like to focus on is what was said about how the Mediterranean region is going to be more heavily impacted by climate change than other regions in Europe. And that, as a Spanish policymaker, that's something that worries me a lot, and we are already taking into account, because in Spain, we already have many areas, many regions that are arid areas. And these areas are going to grow in the future. And these are areas that are already affected by desertification, by drought, by erosion, areas where sometimes forests can't even grow. And the biodiversity that we find in these places won't have enough time to colonize the other areas that will become arid in the near future. So that's going to be a challenge for us in Spain and probably many other parts of Europe. And I think, I don't think anyone has mentioned the concept of assisted migration today yet. Maybe someone has and I just missed it. But I think that this controversial concept of assisted migration is going to be very important in these debates in the future, because forest species won't have enough time to travel north or up into a mountain. So we're going to have to help them somehow. And this is going to be problematic for biodiversity, but maybe necessary for adaptation. This is a debate that we haven't had, in my opinion, we haven't talked about enough yet, and I think it's going to be very interesting and very important in the future. And I think I've already spoken for too long, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Many thanks for that. Jürgen, would you like to comment on, was there anything that struck you in Georg's presentation? No, unmute, please unmute.
Thanks, Kalina. I'll make it very short. I think that this perspective that Georg conveyed of different perspectives on adaptation, more from a conventional forestry side and from a conservation side, I think that is helpful. But we need to move on to develop a joint perspective. I mean, I like discussing, but adaptation is an urgent issue, as Peter has just pointed out. And we can't keep discussing this until the cows come home, because as more time passes by, adaptation becomes increasingly difficult. In 10 years, we will not have the same options that we have now. And we need to be in the position also in particular to respond to disturbances. Take, for example, this discussion whether disturbed areas should be naturally regenerated or planted. I think the result is important, and to get the right result and not how the trees get into the ground.
Thanks for that, because this is the perfect segue into my first block of questions, where I already integrated many of the questions from the floor. So I hope you recognize yourself in them. If you don't, shout in the Q&A function. And that's exactly, so what are the priorities now? As you say, time is running out. Everyone likes to talk, but it's necessary to do and act now. So what are priority steps to increase adaptation as well as biodiversity in European forests, and how do you integrate, like practically, how do you move ahead to integrate these measures in forest management? A specific question that came from a audience member was specifically which types of active management are helpful. So I would like to start with Jürgen, since you kicked off this issue, to respond, move to Daniel, Peter and Kelsey. And please, especially as you were saying, Jürgen, let's try to keep this discussion as practical as possible with concrete examples. And because then exactly I would like to move on to this question, how does the forest of the future perhaps look like, and what are the challenges that we're facing there? Jürgen.
Well, I think the forest area in Europe is vast, and not all forests will be equally impacted by climate change, and some are probably already in a very good adaptive condition. And I think by focusing on those forests that are most at risk of climate change, we will also have probably most synergies between these different objectives. in particular adaptation and biodiversity conservation, because most of these forests that are at high risk are often conifer monospecific forests that have been planted off-site. And there we should, prepare transformation of these forests or initiate transformation of these forests if it hasn't been done, for example, with underplanting of more, adapted species, so that we don't have to start from zero with open conditions if these trees die, where the young trees have problems regenerating in the open and dry conditions. And also be prepared to respond to disturbances so that we can use these large areas, for example, that have been generated through the massive bark beetle outbreaks that we have seen in Central Europe, use these situations to re-establish forests in which way ever. If natural regeneration brings the desired result, fine. Yeah, but we should have a close eye on it to see whether these or how these forests regenerate and what establishes there. And if it is not the species that we want to have there in the future, we should complement that with adapted species and not be dogmatic whether these are species that are native or other species that have been introduced. Important is that we have some experience with these species. And that we know how they will behave. And in this regard, I would like to put in a plea for a more differentiated debate about introduced species. At the moment, everyone throws them all into the same box, but there's a huge difference between species that have been growing here for 150 years and about which we know a lot, or species that are closely related to native species. Take, for example, a Oriental beech, or a Mediterranean oak. If you bring these to Central Europe, I bet they can support the vast majority of the dependent taxonomic diversity that is now on native oaks, or on the native beech. And therefore, they can fulfill these two functions. So let's focus on the critical areas and on things that can be done and need to be done urgently to start with.
Daniel.
Thank you so much. First of all, which types of active management are helpful? That's going to depend on the specific case. It's very difficult to talk about a kind of management that could be helpful for every single case. We have to take into account the local circumstances, the kind of forest that we have, and all those things. So it's very difficult to talk about specific active management types that would be helpful, because in some cases, strict protection, which would not necessarily be active management, but is still a type of management, can be useful in an area that's not going to be heavily affected by climate change. Strict protection can be used, and in that case, maybe some kinds of active management, such as pest control or fire prevention, can be used, and that's going to be useful in some cases. In other cases, we may have to diversify forests, introducing new species to avoid having monoculture, which is not very resilient to climate change in general and not very beneficial for biodiversity. In other cases, other things will have to be done, and that's going to depend on the region, the specific case, the type of forest, etc. And I think that what, I'm sorry, because I'm going to mispronounce your names all the time, but what Jürgen said about the difference between different introduced species is essential, because when we talk about assisted migration, some people seem to think of invasive species being introduced into ecosystems, and that's not the idea. And it's very different to talk about taking a species of oak that grows maybe 100 kilometers to the south of a region and introduce it there because it's going to be better adapted to those circumstances in the future. It's very different to talk about that than to talk about introducing a species from Australia or South Africa that we don't know how it's going to react. So again, assisted migration, like I said before, is going to be something that we are going to have to talk about, and we're going to have to find out how we can use that in a way that's not detrimental for biodiversity. So that would be another priority, in my opinion, discussing that and making sure that we understand how that works, and that we find out a way to use that to ensure that the species that we plant in the future are going to be adapted, I don't know, in 50 years to the climate conditions that we're going to have. And I'm going to stop there. Thanks.
Bitte?
Okay, sorry, my internet connection is a bit shaky. I just focused a little before transformation. I mean, we are up for a period of forest transformation. And the question is really how much by disaster, how much by design. I think and this is something we spelled out in the EU forest strategy. I think countries are well advised to sort of increase also their capacity and the resources for disaster preparedness, and for contingencies, and for post-disaster recovery. We will see a couple of forests and stands, being affected by whatever, fires, pest outbreaks, storms, and so on. And these are indeed opportunities then, of course, to transform forests, sort of in a sort of quick and fast way, if you want. But of course, we should also really support a forest transformation to more sort of resilient forests as part of the ordinary management cycle as much as possible. And prevention is always better, of course, than reacting to a disaster. In the EU adaptation strategy, we have formulated 3 core pillars for good adaptation, which is smarter adaptation, faster adaptation, more systemic adaptation. And the entire strategy follows that logic. I think that logic is also good for forests in a way. With smarter, we mean a better informed, more knowledge-driven adaptations. We need risk assessments, we need vulnerability analysis, we need to have good information about current climate hazards, but also about scenarios. We need forest monitoring systems to see what worked and what didn't. And so I think forest monitoring is very important. I think just last week, the German aero
It seems we've lost Peter. Peter, I would...
Is my internet connection bad?
Yes, perhaps, and if that's okay for you, perhaps you switch off the video for a bit while you, continue your intervention, but switch off the video, and then perhaps the connection is better. Let's try it.
I'm very sorry. I'm sitting right next to my modem. I don't know why. It could also be work related, the work connection. I hope this works now. Okay,
super.
Smarter. I hope it's better now. Faster adaptation. We need, of course, adaptation is going to cost money. The IPCC makes this argument too. We also know that the losses which adaptation helps us to prevent are much bigger. So it's a good idea to reserve these budgets now in order to prevent even major losses in the future. And we need, for example, also tools which allow individual forest owners to assess their risks, to understand what they are going to do. We have been working also, by the way, on we are working on the European legislation on forestry productive material to make sure that there is more cross-border production and exchange of such material, because we will need that. That material needs to come with more information about its suitability for future climates or for climatic conditions. And this is something which we try to get into the new EU framework for forestry productive material. As I said before, countries are well advised also to have a contingency reserve of forestry productive material for future disasters. Just the Baia storm in Italy, for example, flattened a forest surface which was impossible to sort of reforest because Italy didn't have enough planting material. And so there's now a very interesting LIFE project which tries to sort of manage and sort of recover this area in a fairly innovative way. Finally, I think in speaking of more systemic and speaking of money again, I think we also risk management becomes a sort of a core component of future forest management. With that, I also mean financial risk management. There may be sometimes insurance solutions. There are reflections about tax breaks, again, for contingency reserve, for forestry protective material, or for financial reserve for forest owners to come in case of disaster. And these are all these sort of financial mechanisms which allow forest holdings and owners to digest also the financial implications for them. Final point, of course, there's no magic solution. I mean, I think Daniel made that point already. It absolutely depends on the geographic zone where you are and on the management objective of the forest. Adaptation of protective forests in the alpine region is a completely different thing from adaptation of productive forests in Finland or forests in Spain, where I think, yes, unfortunately the climatic situation will be very dramatic, and I'm aware of studies which predict that the southern part of Spain loses the capacity, loses the climate which allows forest growth altogether. So for the southern parts of Spain, southern parts of Greece, some parts of Italy, the outlook is unfortunately really bleak. Thank you.
Thank you. Kelsey, please.
Thanks. So to bounce off a couple of things that have been said so far, I think that the financial question is an important one. I think in the name of trying to reflect the diversity of forests, we have prevented ourselves from defining anything. And as we've seen from the EU Court of Auditors, just throwing cap money at forestry without having an objective of future forest resilience hasn't led to the environmental outcomes that we would like to see. I think it's important to recognize our starting point, that 3/4 of forests are even aged across Europe. 3/4 of them are managed in a clear-cut way. And so there we can say rotational forestry that is relatively intensive is the default. As was mentioned, I don't think we have a silver bullet, but we know that sort of forestry interventions are a spectrum from strict protection to plantation wood production, and that there is a lot of win-win in between, and that we can rely on academic literature to define the types of intervention practices that are out there already and well respected by practitioners, to be able to offer other opportunities for foresters to move in different directions. And the discussion about close to nature forestry or continuous cover forestry is a central area where we can make strides to be able to define what a more resilient forestry practice looks like that tries to do the things that we've mentioned in the call. So diversify tree species, diversify the structure of forest composition. And so the work that's being done to define this practice underneath the forest strategy is definitely an area where I think there needs to be intense academic discussion and input, so that we can move from the field up to the European Union level to define slightly better practices. And then when it comes to this question of experimentation, because we need to see how our forests are going to adapt to climate change, and some species may not be adapted. I think this is where the question of monitoring comes in, and being able to integrate the information that we know about adaptation risk, integrate sort of the information coming back from the trials and errors of what we're doing, to be able to more effectively put our public money back into the forestry sector in a way that's responding to the 3 sustainability objectives that I outlined at the beginning of my presentation. So the more that we can bring practitioners into the room to define what the forest strategy should look like, and move away from sort of this one size fits all rotational forestry as the default, I think the better off we'll be.
Many thanks for that, Kelsey, especially by ending with the practitioners, essentially also the people, as we've already spoken before, that actually do run and operate those forests, which is something that many of the audience would like to know more about. And so I would like to start this block of questions, and we'll read a number, we'll start reading it out, so please bear with me. Some of them I'll try to simplify a little, So thanks very much to all of the audience that that writes these very long questions, but the shorter, the easier for me to read and understand, if I may say. And also just a comment to the panel, please do jump in and comment on each other. No? Like if I see Jürgen raising his eyebrow because he doesn't agree with something that's being said, or Kelsey getting a heart attack because of something else. So please jump in and comment on each other. That's most welcome and much appreciated. But now we'll turn to foresters and how their future should look like, and what also policymakers and others can do. I'll start with a question by Marco Pataka from the Wageningen University. He asks, I'm wondering how you see the intrinsic ecological and socio-economical differences across Europe impact the willingness of forest owners in allocating more weight on one of the three, meaning how does, I guess, the national background impact your preferences in going for biodiversity or adaptation or mitigation? And then he says, we're talking about common forest strategy, which advise on management constraints, but is it really possible to have common constraints given the high heterogeneity of European systems and owner perspectives? I would like to start with Daniel with this question and see what your experience as a policymaker, especially from a special forest country, how you would perceive that, and then move to Jürgen, especially based on your function advising the German government, how you see that debate play out. And on that occasion, I would appreciate also if you could comment a little bit on the relationship between member states and Brussels. I do understand that Peter, of course, is convinced of the Commission's work, and so he should. However, I think it is everyone is aware that member states did not particularly react always enthusiastically to forest policy endeavors of the Commission, and that also forest owners are irritated about some of the aspects. And so I would like the panel then also to comment on that relationship. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question, and thank you, Kalina, for explaining it to us. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the common constraints for forests and whether that's realistic to have common constraints for the whole of the EU. I think this is an issue that we have encountered in many of the debates that we are having as a result of the publication of the EU Biodiversity Strategy and the EU Forest Strategy, because we're trying to come up, for example, with guidelines for closer to nature forestry for the EU. We are trying to come up with a definition and indicators for old growth forests for the EU. And the issue I think the main issue that we have is that variation between different forests in different regions, because the types of forest change, the species change, the uses change, and that makes it very, very difficult to establish common constraints or a common definition or common indicators and thresholds for the EU as a whole. So when we encountered this issue, we were trying to find a way, maybe defining these thresholds or definitions depending on the region, depending on the country, depending on the type of forests, and those are the discussions that we're having at the moment. And regarding how the national background can impact which of these three foresters focus on, that's also very important. And I think we have to add here also the production side of the coin, the economic aspect, because that's very important. And I think that in some cases, in some countries, it's a lot easier to implement biodiversity conservation measures because of the types of forests they have. Here in Spain, for example, we don't really harvest timber in most of our forests. We have protection forests. We have areas where trees are just planted to protect the soil. We have national parks. We have dehesas. So we have so many forests that are not for that, but in other countries, this may not be the case. And that changes a lot how difficult it is for forest managers and for policymakers to implement certain measures. So I'm sorry, I don't have a simple answer to this question. Maybe some of the other panelists will, but I think it's just a huge issue that we just have to take into account in debates, and I'll stop there. Thanks.
Jürgen, the German perspective.
I'm currently part of two processes where we produce papers on relevant issues, papers that have been commissioned by the EFI on, say, more biodiversity friendly forest management in Europe, and another one on, say, the potentials and the evidence for close to nature or closer to nature forest management as a suitable approach for this large block of multifunctional forests. And it is very interesting to be part of such a process, which embraces, say, roughly a dozen or so scientists from different European countries. And you would think, you know, that scientists that are always focused on evidence and so on would quickly agree on, you know, what the issues are and what the evidence for things is. But quite often we do agree in the end, yeah. But it is quite a journey, quite a process, because we come with so different experiences, and hardly any of us has, say, the overview of what is happening in the different corners of Europe. Yeah? And I think that is a fundamental issue. And with regards to the question, what do member states think of? Or let me go one step back, and in terms of how different say, perspectives in different countries, I'd like to add another aspect to that. I think that it is more often a question of different types of owners rather than different nationalities. Now, I would think that, say, for example, state forest owners are a much more homogeneous group than private forest owners. And the difference between, say, state forest owner objectives and private forest owner objectives within one country are much more different than perhaps between countries of people of the similar group. Yeah? And even within private forest owners, you know, huge difference between large, more industrial private forest owners and the small people that own a few hectares. So I think that is more of an issue. There is, of course, the factor of tradition. Yeah? And these traditions can be a real obstacle, in particular also to adaptation. Now, we cannot talk about adaptation without being willing to throw overboard long-held beliefs. And this is one of the most difficult exercises. And therefore, this education, training, outreach is a very important aspect also of this transformation management. Yeah? And something that probably falls into your category of systemic change, Peter. Having said that, and also shown what diversity of perspectives we bring to these issues also from a scientific background, I think that a number of member states don't see these strategies as EU strategies, but strategies by the Commission, that have not been developed in a bottom-up process. At least that is the response that I quite often hear. And I'm sure Peter will respond to that. But I think this is a widely held perspective. These are strategies that have been developed centrally, and people feel that these strategies are imposed on them rather than they had a say in developing these strategies. Mm-hmm. I might leave it there for the moment and wait for the response.
Yeah, exactly. Peter, your defense.
Okay, yeah, maybe to pick the ball up where Jürgen left it, and then I start with the forest strategy. Yeah, of course, I'm aware of this critique of the member state bodies, in particular responsible for forestry in Brussels, that we have done this sort of, you know, in a hidden chamber somewhere. And that's the forest strategy. That's not a critique of the adaptation strategy or of the biodiversity strategy, but of the forest strategy. Let me say that I don't think I have really seen the development of any EU strategy which was sort of as inclusive and as employing as much stakeholder involvement as the forest strategy, up to the very last minute, actually. The last few weeks of such strategy development, it moves up politically. It goes to the cabinets of the commissioners, and there were heavy interventions of member states up to the very last end. So it's and of course we followed the usual approach of an open public consultation and all that workshops. So yeah, okay, it's a critique, but that is actually the experience which I can share about the forest strategy. Let me also say that about the forest strategy. In my observation, I was very, very keen to get a lot of adaptation into the forest strategy because I'm really totally worried about the situation. You know, that's something that really freaks me out a bit into what we are going with forests now. And I'm glad. I think we got a lot of good text and actions into the forest strategy and also in the adaptation strategy, by the way. The adaptation strategy does a lot of stuff on forests, which I think is really genuinely good. Now, my big surprise was that the most of the critique about the forest strategy didn't touch on adaptation at all. Actually, it wasn't picked up by any of the member states. I mean, you know, there was no reaction to that, even though it's everyone says it's one of the key challenges. I find that surprising, and that answer that brings me to the second point, which is a bit about national backgrounds and national angles. It's Daniel, I think, and Jürgen said that already. Every EU member state is a sort of a different planet when it comes to forests. They are in different, of course, located in different geographical areas with different climatic conditions and different forest types. There are very different forest ownership patterns. Jürgen said, Portugal, 90% private forest owners. Poland, much more than half of forests. 80%, I think, is state forest. Maybe the wrong figure, but I think it's about that ballpark figure. Different institutional frameworks, different management approaches, forest dogmas almost, forest traditions. And so we come from very different angles here. And so for adaptation, that means also, again, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. It needs to somehow be emerging from this national context and work within national contexts. What I also can share maybe is that, and we have been going through the national plans under the Resilience and Recovery Facility, and we're going now through the national CAP strategic plans under the Common Agricultural Policy. And the way forests are being addressed there, or actually not addressed, this is also very, very different. What I see is that some member states choose to do this entirely on their national patch and not use, for example, CAP monies. Others do use CAP monies for forests. Some member states which do use CAP money for forests have made an assessment that forests are highly vulnerable, but then this is sort of not really reflected in the proposed measures. This comes back to the point which I made before. What happens at the national level? At the EU level, we can only do so much, and the EU budget sounds like a lot of money, but if you distribute it on the whole of Europe, it's of course dwarfed by national budgets. So to me, the question of national frameworks is an important one, and of course the question, what can the EU do to support anyone? Yeah? And what is it that we should be doing as opposed to national governments? That also brings me to the third point, and again, Jürgen made it about knowledge and what can individual forest owners do, and that's an important constraint, which I think is really across Europe. And there's a couple of studies that forest owners across Europe are very aware actually of climate change, and they're very sort of worried about it, but they lack the knowledge. They don't really know what to do. It was a big surprise for me that, for example, the big forest owner associations turned to the Commission and said, help us to sort of develop a pool of knowledge and good experiences and help us share that across Europe. In response to that, we have a platform which is called Climate Adapt, which we run with the European Environmental Agency. And we have plans this year, and this is also in the forest strategy, in the adaptation strategy, and also the Court of Auditors has sort of suggested this, we will try to build up sort of a part of climate adapt, which looks at management practices and good practice, good adaptation practice, and ways of sharing this across, so that a forest owner from Germany can learn from a Spanish forest owners, because southern Germany may have a similar climate in 2050. So this is for me a very sensible thing which we can do apart from all the other stuff. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Kelsey, from your perspective, especially lobbying and campaigning in Brussels, what role do you see for the EU, especially given the very jealous nature with which member states protect their sovereignty over many forest policies?
Well, I'll try to wrap that into the other two questions that were posed, because I would like to try and address those as well. But I think many saw play out at the EU level the sort of debate between agriculture ministries and environmental ministries as to what the final form of the forest strategy would take. And I would even bring that down to the level of foresters as well. So I completely agree with Peter, and I feel like I learned from a lot of the people that participate in the projects in this room that knowledge and the knowledge gap is a huge issue among a lot of forest owners. And for those that do have deep expertise, there was a mobilization of foresters both in Sweden and in France that were in support of a forest strategy that pushed for more multifunctionality, specifically in developing more the environmental side of the three pillars of sustainability that we talked about. So there is a dynamic conversation, but at times this gets hushed by a higher level political conversation that has a long history of pushing for the productive functions of forests. And so I think we need to reflect the diversity of forests that we have also in the political conversation that we're having in the EU, because I think it will be much more constructive that way. On the question about what would prevent a move towards other sorts of adaptation practices, for example, knowledge was one of them that was presented, but we've also heard from some practitioners that there is a financial cost from moving from, for example, a monoculture even age plantation to another type of forestry practice. And so this is an area where I think a lot of attention should be dedicated. How do we get foresters over that hump to be able to move towards a practice where perhaps you're not going to get a big payoff at the end of 40 years, but you'll move towards a sort of production where you're getting sort of a steady flow of income over time. So I think that's also an obstacle that needs to be addressed. I do want to come back also on the question of, is it possible to have sort of a homogeneous view on, let's take the example of close to nature forestry at the level of the EU? I would argue, yes, it absolutely is. But for certain criteria, we need to make sure that it's applied at the right geographical level. So if we take close to nature, avoidance of clear cutting, for example, is a principle that could be applied across many different member states. Retaining a certain amount of standing or fallen dead trees, this is also something that could be promoted as a principle across the European Union. Now, of course, how much deadwood in the forest, that may depend on the boreal region of forest or Mediterranean regions. I'm sure that the thresholds would be different depending on the type of forest system that we're talking about. And so maybe that discussion needs to be had at a lower level. But to say that we can't have a framework that reflects some principles, I mean, close to nature forestry can be practiced in every single forest ecosystem. So there is definitely an ability to arrive at some guiding principles that are more structured than the free-for-all that we have right now at the European Union level. But this requires quite an intensive discussion with people that understand the subject to be able to set up that framework in a way that that allows for more flourishing than it is restrictive. And I think that's the work that we're trying to undertake right now in the forest strategy.
Thank you very much, Kelsey, also with raising especially the payment issue and the question about how do you incentivize foresters. And I have the feeling that Jürgen and Daniel both reacted to that point. So please, Jürgen, over to you.
Yeah, a couple of responses to Kelsey. So I fully agree that it is possible to come up with general principles of closer to nature forest management that are applicable across Europe. Once this paper is out that we're currently finalizing, you'll see that it is possible. At least the scientists can agree upon that. Of course, the the way you implement the principles and the degree to which you implement the principles, they need to be flexible. And this is important, yeah. I think this was also wide agreement among the people who worked on this paper, that it needs a very flexible implementation, and also the aspects that have been mentioned prior, close monitoring on how effective this is, and what progress can really be achieved with closer to nature forest management. But I also believe it's a suitable model for this large area of non-plantation, non-strict reserve forests that we have in Europe. A model that really reconciles many of the divergent objectives that we have. Regarding the other issue, I also believe that it is absolutely necessary, and that's why I make that point in my presentation, to incentivize forest owners to carry out the kind of forest management that we as a society wish to see, namely forests that meet their mitigation functions, that support biodiversity and are adaptive. But again, I think we need to move quickly here, and cannot or shouldn't try to develop a system that is perhaps 100% foolproof, but takes another 10 years to be implemented on the ground. Maybe that's something for the long term, but we need to have something that is simple and can be implemented soon. So, for example, in our report to the Federal Ministry of Agriculture here on climate change adaptation of forests and forestry, we recommended not to reward individual ecosystem services, where you have a different process for each ecosystem services and a different formula for forest owners to fill in and so on. Some of them don't even apply for the possible support that they currently can have because they can't be bothered with the bureaucracy associated. And so what we have suggested is to reward them for developing and maintaining the resilience and adaptive capacity of forests, because that is the basis for the provision of all ecosystem services. That is the basic condition. It is, of course, and not a small challenge to define exactly what that means, resilience and adaptive capacity, but it's something that can be resolved. We have also defined what sustainability means. So we should be able to define what resilience and adaptive capacity means. And that is one suggestion how one might simplify this based on some indicators that could be easily developed.
Thank you for that. That also addresses two questions we got from the floor, which were exactly about the payment for service schemes, and this question about what market incentives or market instruments could you introduce to incentivize foresters. And Daniel, you also had your hand up, and then Peter, who also wanted to react to that.
Yes, thank you so much, Kalina. So yeah, I wanted to react to the comments made by Kelsey and Peter regarding whether we can apply principles or indicators at EU level. I think that we can definitely choose certain principles, for example, for closer to nature forestry, which could be favoring microhabitats, more deadwood, more species, etc. Those principles can be chosen and can be stated at EU level. In my opinion, the problem comes when we try to define specific thresholds. So, for example, quantity of deadwood or number of species, or etc. Those things cannot be selected at EU level because they change a lot, and they change even within one country, within a region. They depend on the local conditions. Here in Spain, we have forests of the same species that look completely different, natural forests, I mean, So if you look at a home oak forest in the north and a home oak forest in Catalonia and a home oak forest in Andalusia, for example, they have nothing to do with each other. So if you try to, even for just one country, to choose one threshold, so for example, deadwood, for those forests, it would not be relevant. So of course we can choose principles, and I agree with Georgina on the fact that we have to try to find an approach that is simple and that we can implement in the next few years, because we can't wait 10 years to develop the perfect way to do this. And I know that in the debates we've been having in the EU, some member states are against developing indicators or thresholds or principles at EU level because they consider forest policy to be a national competence. And that's not Spain's case at all. We understand that the EU has a lot of competences such as environment, climate, etc., that influence forests. So we don't agree with that. But the reason why we think that thresholds cannot be chosen at EU level is because it is extremely difficult, and local conditions would have to be analyzed for every single type of forest. And coming back now to the comments made by Peter about the EU forest strategy, I was not involved in the development of the previous strategy, so I don't know how that happened. But in the development of this one, it is true that stakeholders and member states were allowed to make comments about, for example, the roadmap. And this is something that I've said many times when I talked to Commission representatives. You have groups of experts, from national experts and also stakeholder experts, that can help you with the development of these strategies. And if you had shown the text of the strategy before its publication, those experts, they would have been able to make comments about them to help you improve the text, to ensure that the text that is published in the end is actually adapted to the conditions in all member states. Because it's very difficult for the Commission alone to take everything into account. There are too many things. So that's why I've said so many times that more involvement of those stakeholders, environmental organizations, member states, and scientific institutions would have been better to ensure that the document that is published in the end could have the support from all those people. And I haven't been particularly critical about the text that you published, but I've said that because I think that those fora have to be used much more because they are so useful. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Daniel. I think that's very helpful to also for the audience to understand how much European Commission strategies do occupy the minds and times of people. So at least that's something. But I am in your response, Peter, and I do understand Daniel's point. However, if you could perhaps mostly focus your responses on some of the issues that were discussed before, especially on what kind of incentives we can give foresters, and focus on the practical solutions, and perhaps you and Daniel can exchange some more best practices separately.
No. Pretty cool. No, many thanks for that. No, just so much on the EU forest strategy. I really invite everyone also not to just focus on that strategy, but see it in conjunction with other strategies. They work really like that. We have designed them to work together. So please do also look at the soil strategy, the biodiversity strategy, the adaptation strategy, the Fit for 55 package on mitigation and all that. And actually, we really have a process in place to make the links between all these pieces of legislation. And we work very intensively across services in the Commission to sort of make sure that they sort of are different stones in a wider mosaic. Yeah? By the way, also thanks for supporting our view also that forest is a shared competence. And this is also what the Commission's legal service says very, very, very clearly. Now, coming back on the incentives, two things maybe. Before I come to financial incentives, I still do think that really knowledge, skills, and actually having the workforce at all, is paramount. And I've seen a couple of studies, and there was a major study on forest ownership also in Europe. Forest owners, and in particular private forest owners, are a very bright bunch, much more bright than we think. And they're actually, but that was very surprising for me to see just how self-driven private forest owners are. You know, they have their own motivations, and about 30% of them manage their forests actually with the view to sort of improving their sort of environmental conditions of forests. So they're very green, really. They have also a disproportionately high share of Natura 2000 areas, by the way. All that to say that we have also indications that financial incentives, especially for private forest owners, only will take you so far. And many other things need to be in place. And one of them is really motivation also, and knowledge and skills and workforce. Now, on financial incentives, I think one very practical thing which we're preparing in DG Klima right now is what we call the carbon farming scheme. The wording is a bit unfortunate because this is not just about farming, but this is also, of course, this is about land use in terms to improve the land sink function. It's in December, and we're working this year on a carbon certification scheme. So ideally that by, I think 28 is the idea that landowners can actually get certified, a certified account of the sort of carbon which their land sequesters. And this is then something they could, you know, if such schemes were in place, could use in carbon trading schemes. A bit like, okay, UK dropped out of the European Union, but they had this woodland carbon scheme, which was sort of also a reward, a financial incentive scheme for the amount of carbon, you know, being sequestered by a patch of land. Of course, the integrate and the sincere projects both also, and I think integrate, for example, you know, with deadwood and habitat trees and all that. These are all things which you could think could be incentivized financially. Now, once again, many member states, in my experience, are reluctant at least to take European money in their hands to sort of use this money to incentivize, which they actually could do. And I'm aware of some national schemes. But again, this is something which for the time being is very much at the national level. And
I think you got stuck again if you switch off the video. Now you're back. Yeah.
Okay, sorry for that. My internet connection is really terrible today. I don't know what it is.
All good. If you just finish your last point, because that unfortunately got lost.
So, sorry, I hope if you did lose my last point, that was basically about the potential of the integrated and sincere projects, you know, in addition to carbon farming, to identify other criteria on additional hooks for financial incentive schemes, and that I believe that still few member states are inclined to use European monies, which they could, to set up financial incentive scheme, incentive schemes, but I'm aware of several national schemes. And again, this is something which very much then happens at the national level and depends from one, you know, varies from one member state to the other. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Peter. Kelsey, you want to respond to that? Please do. And then we're running out of time. Then I would wrap it up with one final question to you. Kelsey, first response.
Yes, I think it requires a whole nother webinar with everyone here today to also discuss payments for ecosystem services. But a concern that we have on the way that the carbon farming initiative has been presented is it doesn't reflect the diversity of the types of actions that have been demonstrated by the Sincere project, for example, where there's a clear emphasis of trying to optimize for multiple ecosystem services, where we're really looking at biodiversity. And the narrative that we've heard associated with the carbon farming is voluntary carbon markets coming in to grow forests quicker and plant them everywhere, and we'll kind of mess with the details a little bit later. The fact that that is dominating the narrative when the voluntary market in Europe is very small compared to the international market is quite a concerning sign, because I think this means it's not taking up the lessons of the quite complicated discussion of how to make payment for ecosystem services work for the forester, as opposed to consultancies that run carbon market projects all over the world. And I think we need to nip that in the bud quite quickly and make sure that it is focused around foresters and the forest industry and multifunctionality in the close to nature forestry and other concepts that we have discussed here today, to be able to meet the obstacles that we had mentioned that foresters have to be able to transition to other types of practices. So a lot of discussion to be had there in the future, I think.
If I can come in very quickly, thanks Kelsey for the feedback. Carbon certification will be a legal proposal, so once again, open public consultation, stakeholder involvement process. Please do take part and raise your points.
Thanks for that. And yes, I think everyone who's following, especially like market-based instruments, and of course the NGOs have been watching that for quite a while with concern. But I think generally it's going to be a really interesting space to see how you can actually quantify and use data to create a market in the future. However, moving on, because now we literally have 2 minutes left. I thank everyone for the discussion so far. And I was just hoping to finish with one last question. And I do have to ask you for keeping your answers brief, but there was one question from the floor that picked up a point that Jürgen had raised earlier, and that goes back to the people who are supposed to implement these changes and traditions. And the question is asking, how do you essentially overcome these long-held beliefs and this idea that what's worked in the past will work in the future? And so I would like to pose that question to everyone to give me like a one line, what you think will be the most convincing way of changing these views, or shifting the approach to it across Europe. Thanks.
If I can make a start, maybe, I think it's peer-to-peer communication. If the forest owner, I thought, if the forest owner from southern Germany hears it from the forest owner of Spain and sees it, I think that helps.
Moving on to Daniel, from the commission owner to the Spanish policymaker.
Thank you. Of course, it's impossible to answer this in just one sentence, but I'll try. I think we have to get involved organizations, environmental organizations, forest owner organizations, local administrations, regional administrations, because we cannot do this from the EU or even from a national government. We have to get involved with the local communities and make sure that they understand that we know how important their traditions are to them. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks. I think the whole issue of indigenous knowledge and using indigenous knowledge is a whole separate chapter that I guess could also fill an entire webinar. Kelsey.
I think on top of everything that was mentioned, defining a direction of travel, using the knowledge that we have today, even if it's incomplete, is going to, it helps for companies. I think it can also help for the entire sector to just lay out things clearly with the definitions and the practices that we know are a good bet, and then have these peer-to-peer discussions and use the knowledge to implement it.
Jürgen.
I also believe that people learn best from things they can see by themselves, and therefore exchange across Europe is certainly more important than, say, showing an individual forest owner in one part of Europe outputs from a model they would probably not believe in. Yeah? So I think that is important. And there's this nice saying in English, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And I think this is also an issue. A lot of forest owners in Europe are old, yeah? And we need to change that. Now, we need to bring young people into forest management. They need to think this is a cool issue, yeah? And we need to engage them because we need new ideas, new perspectives. And therefore, if we can also work on that, yeah, that also the transition of forest ownership within families gets a bit accelerated, that would certainly help.
Thank you, Jürgen. I think that that comment on generational changes is the perfect way to end this, considering also that it's essentially at the heart of all of the climate discussions, and the purpose of climate policy to pass on to next generations. And I think it's also helpful to come back to the people, because I think everywhere in Europe, or at least also in Germany or elsewhere, there you do have the sense that sometimes there are stigmas around certain professions or roles, and considering that that these are people that are trying to do their best, even though they may not do that, I think is something worth remembering, in many cases at least. And so I thank you for all of your contributions, and thank you for being part of this. And with this, the webinar is closed.
Many thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.